Alexis de Tocqueville, in the second volume of De la démocratie en Amérique, according to the author's own statement and essay on democracy rather than on the United States, wrote the following words. Je ne connais pas du pays où il règne en général moins de dépendance d'esprit et de véritable liberté de discussion qu'en Amérique. En Amérique, la majorité trace un cercle formidable autour de la pensée. L'Inquisition n'a jamais pu empêcher qu'il ne circulât en Espagne des livres contraires à la religion du plus grand nombre. L'empire de la majorité fait mieux aux États-Unis et l'a ôté jusqu'à la pensée d'en publier. These remarks were made in the middle of the first century of the democratic revival, 50 years after the inception of the French Revolution. By that time, it was evident to several acute observers that an internal, truly teleological contradiction exists between democracy, a form of government, and the liberal principle, applicable to many domains. Between the combined postulates of civic equality and majority rule on one hand, and the insistence on personal freedom on the other. This insight was shared by the majority of America's founding fathers, by de Tocqueville, by Cooper, Proudhon, later by the great Swiss, Constant, Bachhofen, Amiel, Binet, Burckhardt, and finally by so many of our contemporary genuine liberals. Naturally, we should not be surprised to find the freedom of speech in the private or public sphere severely curtailed by the ideologies representing the more radical branch of Jacobin democracy. Nobody expected that Danton, Robespierre, or Babeuf, who all owe so much of their political inspiration to Sade, the divine marquis, or that the Marxian socialists, the National Socialists, the Bolsheviki, after all the majority wing of those dear progressive social democrats in Russia, would tolerate freedom of thought, freedom of opinion. What interests us here primarily is the very subtle and, at the same time, profound crisis of intellectual freedom which manifests itself today not only in the tyrannies of the East, and the newer ones in the South, of course, but in those democracies which honestly want to adhere to liberal principles. Here, however, we do not want to lose sight of the fact that in certain countries, this particular problem is being obscured, vitiated, and complicated by tragic historical events. Countries which went through the diabolic sieves of war, revolution, occupation, mass recrimination, and discrimination. Our men in the street, and even their betters, remind us so vividly of Mr. Go Lightly, Herr Leisetritt, in Hermann Borchardt's great conservative novel dealing with tyranny in its sordid aftermath, The Conspiracy of the Carpenters, New York, 1943. The fear to go on record, the horror for any real commitment, the timid clinging to officially sanctioned cliches certainly characterize large areas in free Europe where, within the last 40 years, the supporters of all imaginable ideologies have been subjected to indignities, to the curtailments of their rights and to persecutions, if not to mass exile and mass murder. Therefore, it is not surprising that people adhering to ideologies frowned upon by liberal democracy, even today still insist on being good Democrats or real Democrats, which sometimes means that, within certain mental reservations, they go on hoping to achieve their goals, some of a liberal, many of a highly illiberal nature, by the democratic procedures of majority decision and majority rule. Such talk in democraties is neither necessarily dishonest nor mere camouflage, as the democratic roots of our modern mass ideologies, all stressing some sort of identity, of sameness, Nämlichkeit, can hardly be contested. Tel est l'empire du mot démocratie que nul gouvernement, nulle parti n'ose vivre et ne le croit pouvoir sans inscrire ce mot sur son drapeau. Guizot wrote these words in 1849, but they are as true today as they were then. Hitler, Mussolini, Lenin, Kwame Nkrumah, Mao Zedong, and Sékou Touré have all claimed to be true Democrats, but certainly not liberals. Thus, the crisis of the freedom of thought and speech manifest in the historic liberal democracies, no less in those of a more recent vintage, varies in its aspects and even in its nature, region by region. The average Austrian, for instance, who calls himself a democrat, fluently talks democratese and in a way is a democrat, who often makes sincere efforts to accept and assimilate the dogmas of democratism. Probably he's a man born under the monarchy who, like my humble self, went through 5 radically different forms of government, each forcing upon him new laws and ideologies, new flags and new hymns, new coins, new currencies, new stamps, new rather superficial loyalties and codes of behavior. He may be a democrat partly out of sheer resignation, partly for material satisfaction, partly out of prudence, but he lacks the deep conviction of an American or of a Swiss, an Englishman or an Icelander, to whom democracy is much more than just a system of government. To a large number of continentals, however, their democracy is merely the product of a restoration engineered by a victorious military alliance, motivated by different reasons, an alliance which brought democracy back to deserted parliaments, just as the Bourbons were brought back to their thrones by another successful coalition 130 years earlier. We have talked about democratism last but not least because the new conformity, which certainly is not a strictly political phenomenon, receives its most pregnant expression in the political field. Of course, every absolutism is hostile to freedom of thought and expression, is propagating identity and attacking diversity. However, the freedom Western Europe enjoyed in the era of so-called royal absolutism, an era in many respects more liberal than our age of conscription, prohibition, confiscatory taxes, and social engineering, was due perhaps not so much to royal generosity than to a great number of local representative bodies counterbalancing the absolutism at the top. Yet absolutism always remains an evil, regardless of whether it has a royal or a democratic character. In this connection, we, nevertheless, are not permitted to forget that modern republican democracy is an absolutism, since it derives its authority solely from one source, majority will. We have abandoned the classic concept of the regimen mixtum. Thanks to the constitutional paralysis of the monarch, who at present is merely a psychological factor, it could rightly be said of the British Parliament that it now can do everything under the sun, except change a man into a woman or a woman into a man. Still, this does not answer our question why liberty of opinion and discussion, no less than originality of thought, have declined so tragically and perceptibly in our day and age. There was probably more liberty of spirit in the days when the fires of the Spanish Inquisition were blazing than in the middle-class republics of today. Nicholas Berdyaev lamented in Novoye Srednjovjekovje, the new Middle Ages. But there is a profound and tangible cause for this state of affairs. The late Harold Laski, in his Parliamentary Government in England, insisted that parliamentary democracy can only exist and survive if 2 conditions are met. A two-party system, and, more important still, B, a common framework of reference, a common ideological, philosophical denominator, uniting these parties, which thus become, in American parlance, mere ins and outs. The situation has already been achieved in the English-speaking nations, from New Zealand to Britain, and it can also be said, without much danger of refutation, that while the two-party system is neither fully developed in Scandinavia nor in Switzerland, the bloc d'idées incontestable, the common framework of reference, there is well established. Democracy in these countries is conforming to the precepts of Laski, and thus is truly organic. This situation, however, could only be achieved due to the conscious and far more so to the subconscious effort of a society, not of a state, which felt and still feels instinctively that a system of government would be doomed if the people were divided by real ideological differences. In other words, it is not the state which imposes a conformity of thinking, speaking, or printing, but the live, spontaneous forces of society which almost automatically silence and isolate the basic political nonconformist. Let us take America, for instance, where we see a society highly skilled in promoting the spirit of uniformity, having had the practical experience of assimilating millions and millions of immigrants who had to be cast into a new national and ideological mold. In the United States, every high school textbook, every presidential message, every radio address, every valedictorian speech, every bestseller, every radio play, every film, and every newspaper editorial, provided they deal with political fundamentals, will praise republicanism and democracy, democracy and republicanism. Thus, if we could stop a subway train in New York during the rush hours, line up all its strap-hanging human sardines, and ask them about their basic political views, we would find that 100% profess to be Republicans with a small r, and 999 out of 1,000 profess to believe in democratism. The lone dissenter, we might assume, has read the violently anti-democratic writings of America's founding fathers. In Madrid or Barcelona, however, making the same experiment, mutatis mutandis, we will discover a breathtaking variety of ideologies and unofficial allegiances. Liberal monarchists and monarchical absolutists supporting the various branches of the Bourbon dynasty. So-called Christian Democrats with or without Falangist affiliations. Republican Democrats and Democratic Socialists. Separatists and anarchists. Stalinists and Trotskyists. Syndicalists of various persuasions. Republican liberals and downright fascists. The sky would be the limit. Now, is this solely because Spain is a Catholic nation, nourished by the strongly libertarian aspects of Catholic theology? The political term liberal, after all, is of Spanish origin, imported to England by Sade in Scotland. Or is this variety of opinion behind the facade of an authoritarian regime the result, to use a term taken from our folklore, of the late Enlightenment, of Spain's backwardness? Of course, more than one factor has to be taken into consideration. But looking at Central and even Eastern Europe, only 50 years ago, a period which some of us still vividly remember, we will observe a far greater variety of opinions and also much greater courage to utter them, to put them into print and to discuss them than it is evident right now. In Switzerland and in the democratic states, only the esprit fort dare to reject the democratic dogmas, but in the rest of Christendom, variety rather than uniformity was the keynote. No wonder, as the prevailing form of rule was mixed government, with the crown acting as a clasp, as a unifying factor. Ideological strife and divisions under such circumstances were uncomfortable but not fatal. The sometimes stormy elections and the even stormier sessions in the parliaments did not rend nations asunder. Then one could afford to have ideological differences. Conformity and excessive restraint, uniformity and the humble acceptance of official slogans had not become a civic duty and the order of the day. Not only social societal freedoms was much greater than it is today, and this although the differences between classes in the states were more marked, but even the political liberties were better protected. Let us, for argument's sake, imagine a street scene in Europe's relatively most absolutistic country, Russia, back in 1912. There across the square in St. Petersburg, we see a bearded man hurrying with a newspaper under his arm. Who is he? A member of the Imperial Duma. What political faction does he belong to? To the Bolshevik wing of the Social Democratic Party. What paper is he carrying? The Pravda. Where did he buy it? At the street corner. Aren't the poor Bolsheviks brutally persecuted by the almighty emperor? Well, in Imperial Russia, not a single communist had been executed as, since the days of Alexander II, only those making attempt against the life of the emperor or members of the imperial family were subjected to the death penalty. Unlike the anarchists, the communists did not believe in individual action. And to get a notion of life in jail under Nicholas II, we only have to read the memoirs of Trotsky. In viewing the ideological scene of the countries further west, we inevitably come to similar conclusions. Austria-Hungary, Germany, Belgium 50, nay, even 30 years ago, were brimming with ideological discussion based on opposing philosophies and theologies. A discussion today not entirely dead, but deprived of its dynamism, its conviction, its depth, its intellectual charm and magnificence. Qualities surviving today only in the very heart of the Orbis Catholicus. There, the big trauma is less evident, the pressure from the East is less effective, and a disciplinarian community conformity spirit stemming from the Reformation faiths is nearly absent. The variety of live ideas in France has no counterpart in either Germany or Austria. We could imagine, for instance, we could not imagine a poster as that of the Sade paint manufacturing company a few years ago in the French subway, where you saw 4 large Mariannes and the 5th one just looking coyly around the corner, and there it said, "The republics come and go, but the Sade paints stay forever." The tierischer Ernst would have prevented anything of the sort here in our center. After this inventory, we must come to the sad conclusion that in the Free West, by and large, the will to discuss basic political questions, metapolitics, political philosophy and theory, except behind closed doors among theologians, is at a new low point. Max Weber has reminded us that the great plains of Russia and the United States, die zum Schematismus neigen, the tendency towards schematic thinking, have no innate leaning towards freedom. Thomas Jefferson told us of America that this country, which has given to the world the example of physical liberty, owes to it that of a moral emancipation also. For as yet, it is but nominal with us. The inquisition of public opinion overwhelms in practice the freedom asserted by the law in theory. These are bitter words indeed. And actually, if you make a survey of American publishing and you look at the fate of nonconformist book as handled by the American press, we can go here from Walter Lippmann's Public Philosophy down to Felix Somaris' Krise und Zukunft der Demokratie, which is called Democracy Bay, which received 5 lines, though published by a reputable big publishing house. Then you understand what I mean. Obviously, one can treat this mounting tide of conformity as part and parcel of a waning courage of conviction in all domains of thought and feeling. We encounter this phenomenon today even in the Catholic Church, where only 10 years ago a pope, a unique event in church history, felt that he had to exhort the faithful to speak up on matters which are not dogmatically settled. He reminded a group of assembled Catholic journalists that without a live opinion, the church would be in a sad condition, and that the members of the press would be amiss in their duty, not only if they indulged in destructive criticism, but also if they persevered in a servilisme muet, in a dumb servility. And of course, where's today the Catholic painter who paints a fresco in a church at the western entrance and shows popes and bishops and emperors, or presidents, of course, bank presidents going to hell. But that's all. We're living in the modern age. Now, you see here, the problem as we see here, one could argue that the present situation in traumatic Europe is the lesser of two evils. Seemingly the specter, especially in Central Europe, of another 1932-1933 is not hanging over this usually so seismic area. Yet first of all, I do not trust this sort of stability. Democracy here is not a solid dogma. Its roots have hardly penetrated the surface. Its various scientifically unprovable tenets taken separately are not really believed. Actually, a tremendous vacuum exists in Western Europe, and especially so in the German-speaking areas. Too many among us want to disregard the danger signals. This escapist expected modern youth will persevere in its present stage of anti-intellectual Epicureanism and nihilism, which is a vain hope. if I hope it is. As a matter of fact, the younger ones among the young no longer share the memory of the misuse of their parents' idealism, and we have to doubt strongly that they will forever content themselves with the repetition of official formulas and cliches. At the same time, we have no guarantees that the ideas and notions the growing generation might adopt will be truly liberal. 15 years have elapsed since the new restoration, and we should not forget that from the July Revolution back to Waterloo, exactly also 15 years, half a generation have elapsed, and then things started moving. There is moreover, in face of the danger from the East, a real and urgent necessity to view and to review our political problems from the vantage point of personal liberty, no less than that of material and moral preparedness. And above all, I would say of intellectual preparedness. Yet such intellectual preparedness is possible only within a free exchange of thought and going down to truly to the roots, take up the political problems, ask the monumental questions whether our political institutions, from the Iron Curtain to San Francisco, whether they are really and truly ideally fitted for the two roles of the survival of freedom in these countries, and also, on the other hand, to stem materially and practically, and militarily if you like, the onslaught from the East. But this, of course, the Socratic dialogue is by no means a postulate of the masses, who think in the terms rather of emotions and the satisfaction of their material needs. In the realm of the intellect and spirit, however, new insights, new cognitions, and, let us use the hackneyed expression, real progress can only be achieved by the interchange of ideas, well reflected, manly spoken, earnestly listened to, carefully weighed, rejected, modified, or accepted. I thank you for paying attention to me for a lecture which only raises dilemmas, but not a single practical solution. Before even talking about the failure of democracy in Europe, we must really know and be aware of what is really democracy. Democracy is, don't forget that, a political term. It's not a social term. And it answers the question, who should rule? And the answer it gives is the majority of politically equal citizens, either in person or through the representatives. Whereas liberalism, rightly understood, that is, liberalism is understood in the whole wide big world, with the exception of the United States, answers the question not who should rule, but how should rule be exercised. And the answer it gives is, regardless of who rules, government must be exercised in such a way that each individual citizen enjoys the maximum of personal liberty. In other words, equality in majority rule characterizes democracy. Freedom characterizes liberalism. Now, of course, there is such a thing as a liberal democracy, but obviously, liberalism could be combined with other forms of government. And a democracy can be illiberal. You can have a democracy where the 51% really and truly, brutally suppress and tyrannize the 49% or the 99%, 1%. A man like Louis XIV, for instance, from our modern point of view, the man who allegedly had said, "I am the state," was of course a very great liberal by modern standards. He couldn't draft anybody in his kingdom. If he wanted to wage a war, he had to rely on volunteers, and they had to be very well paid. He could not have, let us say, an annual general confession about the economic life of a person. If anybody wanted to make a general confession, you went, of course, to a priest, not to the collector of internal revenue. A man like Louis XIV, for instance, could never decree that his beloved subjects could not drink Chartreuse or Benedictine or Sauterne or Châteauneuf-du-Pape, or Veuve Clicquot, if he had done anything like that, in other words, started a prohibition, his beloved subjects would have quartered him alive within 48 hours. But all this can be done today, you see, with the democratic principles, because the idea is the people who are elected, they identify themselves with the citizenry, and they say, you, that's us, and us, that's you, and you voted us in this position, and we do not stand on thin ice as the monarchs of old. Now, if you look at the back now, the development of democracy in Europe, bear in mind that democracy is a very primitive form of government. I've made studies of the Bambutis in Rwanda, Urundi, pygmies, who have a completely democratic society. And then, of course, on a sophisticated level, you see in Europe the rise of democracy in Greece, originally called isonomia, equality of law, and the first great victim and the discrediting of that Greek democracy happens through the assassination of Socrates. Socrates was forced to commit suicide. He was condemned to death, as you know. Why? Because he corrupted the youth. What did it mean? He ridiculed democracy. He quoted Homer, ukagaton, polykoirane, and so forth. If you don't believe me, read it up in the Encyclopedia Britannica. That was the real reason. You don't get it in the average school textbook. Now you see, looking from the Acropolis and looking down to the Areopag, you see very clearly the place democracy had the first time morally founded. And therefore, do not be surprised that not so much later you find Socrates, who has nothing to do with the famous Socrates, who implored the fate to send to Greece again a monarch, to start a monarchical age. Now, for many, many, many centuries, democracy, except in very primitive areas, in the Alps, in the Tyrol, where I come from, after all, in neighboring Switzerland, in certain city-states, in certain peasant communities, democracy is absent, and just like a U-boat, like a submarine surfacing, democracy comes back again to our countries with the French Revolution, in a forest of guillotines. And you see at that time, of course, enticed by pictures, by the magic picture of the United Kingdom, whose great propagator was Voltaire, and then, of course, thanks to the influence of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, in other words, the Swiss example, and then finally the American example in the most tragic fashion, because as you all know, the founding fathers were violently opposed to democracy. And nevertheless, the idea is, and you have unfortunately a man like Lafayette, so many people thoroughly and basically misunderstanding, not the American Revolution, there was no revolution, the American War of Independence and these ideals, and transplanting them finally to France. Because the American Republic was an aristocratic republic, inspired the aristocracy of all of Europe. They were coming en masse to the United States. You just have to go to Washington, D.C., and see there in front of the White House on Jackson Square, in the center, the monument of Old Hickory, and in the four corners, the monuments of these four European noblemen who have come to this country to fight for liberty, but not for democracy. Tadeusz Kościuszko, Baron von Steuben, the Comte de Rochambeau, the Marquis de Lafayette. Now you see, democracy comes into the European scene as a sort of very curious ideal. The idea is that original sin can be unmade, the coercive power of the state is going to vanish, we no longer are being ruled, we rule ourselves. But as of course you know very well indeed, on April the 15th, if you make out the income tax declaration, you are not really ruling to self. This is majority rule in the representatives, and we cannot escape, you see, the curses of original sin, just as the idea taking off your clothes and then you become innocent as in paradise. Nudism in their form is really an analogy to democracy. And then you get finally the American intervention, because unfortunately the United States gets through amendments more and more democratized, and you have the great tragedies of 1918, 1919,
In other words, a war won for democracy, ending in a defeat of liberty. And again in 1945, a war won for democracy and another defeat of liberty. The result of number one is the rise of Lenin, of Hitler, of Mussolini. The result, of course, of number two, finally, is the overpowering strength of the Soviet Union and the emergence of Chinese communism. In other words, the enormous American deception. And Lasky was very right in pointing out, and here we come now to the reason of the difficulties of democracy in Europe, that unless two premises are being met, and that is the two-party system on one side, and on the other side, a common framework of reference, a public philosophy, where people are mere ins and outs. Unless you meet these two conditions, you cannot have a stable democratic government. And Europe, of course, is ideologically utterly divided at the present moment, or until recently, to be more precise, it was not so evident. This new tremendous European prosperity had hidden the fact that these ideological forces are still alive. They are now breaking out again. People got used to that prosperity. People are again starting to think. The ideological uniformity of Europe is breaking up, and maybe so is yours. This is a momentous development now in our entire Western history. Because don't forget, democracy is only a frame. It's only a frame. It is not a picture. If now, for instance, let us say, for instance, 51% of any country votes a Nazi ticket or votes a communist ticket, then that country is becoming communist or Nazi democratically. I'm using here the adverb of the form. Situations which were strange to you in the past, and I hope they'll be spared to you in the future. Visiting a hard-hitting Catholic newspaper early in March 1948 in Rome. The name of the paper was Brancaleone. In Rome, on April the 18th, 1948, there was an election touch and go, because there was a real danger that the combined communist left socialist ticket might gain a majority. And walking into these editorial offices, I'm asking the young man and said, now do tell me, young man, none of them was above the age of 23 or 24. I said, now do tell me, for whom are you going to vote next month? And they say, oui, next month, of course. De Gasperi, for the Democrazia Cristiana. I say, Democrazia Cristiana? Are you really Democrats? And the usual confusion between the democratic and the liberal principle. They say, yes, yes, we are Democrats. And then I said, listen, boys, if you're Democrats, then you have to respect the verdict of the majority. So if the communists get 51%, will you say, as good Democrats, yes, amen, the nation hath spoken, and we bow to its verdict? And they said, well, of course not. And we take our rosaries and our submachine guns, go up to the rooftops and shoot it out. But you see here, a dilemma unknown to you, because never forget here the one thing, the fact which Plato has told us, Book 9, of his Republic, uc alles politeias tyrannis catistata eg democratias, not from another form of government does tyranny arise, but out of democracy, because democracy gives the real frame to the demagogos, to the demagogue, to the people's leader, who humbly says, oh no, I am not a ruler, I'm only leading you along, I'm personifying you, I am not a father. Away with the father image. I'm a man, a fellow like you and me, I'm a square, I'm a brother, big brother. You see, this is precisely the evolution, and it's for that reason that Metternich said, during the French Revolution, when liberté, fraternité, égalité, you know, said Metternich, if I see how the name brother is being used now in France, I'm very much inclined to call my own brother cousin. But here we come now to an important point, and this is the father point, the father image, which after all is deeply engraved in Europe and will remain engraved as long as there are families in Europe, as long as the fathers are kings in the families. And if really you actually go now and look at the newspaper kiosk and look at these cheap weekly papers which we have in Europe, which you do not have in America, it's nothing like Look, and it's nothing like Time, it's nothing like Life. These cheap, very cheap papers written for the broad masses, what does really interest them? And the answer is nothing but the loves and the divorces, or the pending divorces, or the menacing divorces, and the marital misunderstandings, and the pregnancies, and the births, and the funerals of the members of the defunct European monarchies. It's Faradiba, and it's Elizabeth, and it's Prince Philip, and on the whole line down to the Near East, because of course we already have a scarcity of that material. The father-mother image, the concept of the whole nation as a family is exceedingly strong. And do you know, some of you have read probably the San Francisco Chronicle on the 26th of this month. And there you find a report at the Bild Post in Germany and that Quick, two magazines conducted the Gallup poll discussing who should follow President Lübke, who made himself so ridiculous in Germany and who's now stepping down. And 40% of the readers, by far the largest block, Prince Louis Ferdinand of Prussia, the grandson of William II. There you are now. We are now 50 years away from 1918. It doesn't really change, because the European is cynical. He knows that he is not really voting the people into power, that he's only really very, very microscopic whether he stays at home and actually goes to the polls, that as a person it would make no difference. But on the other side, there's also growing another cognition, and one again which is not only purely European, of purely European interest, but of a general interest, and that is the fact of the ever-widening gap between the scita and the scienda. That means between the things, between the knowledge of the man in the street, and when I say the man in the street, I don't mean the man who is semi-literate or illiterate. No, the man who really follows the radio, who has a high school education, who has a college education. And nevertheless, what he can really know and what he ought to know, the difference in order to rationally judge these events is so enormous and is getting constantly bigger and bigger, even if it were true that general education increases the educational levels in an arithmetic progression. The things which ought to be known go up in a geometric progression. What does the average American know about Vietnam? What do the protesting students know about Vietnam? Absolutely nothing. They can only make an act of faith in the best Lutheran fashion in either this or in that commentator. What does the average Englishman know, for instance, about Rhodesia? He knows nothing whatsoever. You see, David Riesman has said sex is the last frontier, and that is true in the emotional domain. But in the intellectual domain, it is religion and politics, politics and religion, where everybody can shout his mouth off, but the feeling is growing, we really know nothing about these affairs. And of course, that shakes the faith in democracy, which of course makes sense in the Tyrolean village where I live, or the Canton Glarus of 38,000 people debating whether one should give a license to a chocolate factory or not. This is within the scope of the 7,000 sturdy Swiss men in the marketplace in Glarus. It's a wonderful picture. But the big man in the Mars state, what does he know? And does not this more and more invite the rule by experts, the cold-blooded rule by experts? And then the question comes, who is going to control the experts? What are we going to do if the experts, as it usually happens, contradict each other? These are unsolved questions. These were questions more or less solved in the monarchies of old. But they appear like a golden age way back in the background. Because the man in the street, if you ask him, does he believe in democracy? Of course he nods, he does. Does you believe in the Republican system? Most people do. But at the same time, of course, the word democracy is a complete weasel word. What we need is a democratic monarchy. Hitler had spoken about Nazism, eine deutsche Demokratie, and Mussolini una democrazia organizzata. And Lenin, demokratia po novomu, a democracy in a new style. So it's everywhere, and of course, therefore, nowhere. And now comes a new political, there is a little bit of the old nationalism now coming up. There's coming up the new left. And the new left is exceedingly interesting because in the new left, if you really study their books and works, the whole critique, what they call the establishment. I don't know how many of you gentlemen realize, and how many of these writing students realize, that 2/3 or 3/4 of their critique of the modern democratic liberal state is exactly the same critique as of the old European conservatives from the early 19th century, where they had foretold, they said, if you have a purely commercial civilization, the whole thing just won't do. It will end all in planning. It ends in rat races. It ends in a dull sort of materialism. It's all the prophecies of the old conservatives, which they are using without realizing that they do, because maybe that even their ideological leaders don't realize that. And of course, in other words, this thing, this feeling, what they call in Germany, for instance, das Unbehagen in der Demokratie, this feeling of uneasiness, of emptiness, of dullness, it has no warmth. It's a fight for numbers. Now, mind you, this does not mean that I foretell you a return to monarchy now or in the foreseeable future. All this tiredness with politicians. Oh, I would say 100 years ago, if you said ein Politiker, a politician, oh, that was a fine thing. That was a sort of an intellectual and so on. But today it gets slowly the same flavor as in the United States. And the people distinguish very carefully between politicians and statesmen. And they said, you know, Adenauer, that was not a politician. He was a statesman. And of course, as much as they dislike de Gaulle, and de Gaulle is by no means a popular man in France, but he's respected. He's respected. He's a sort of statesman. He doesn't really do very little politics. A man like Franco, also not really popular at all, but nevertheless, grudging admission. People who have been very long on their jobs, who now really know the ropes, who have really an age-old experience, who know the people around the country, and of course, really are going at least to some places, even in spite of failures, even in spite of the failure of de Gaulle's East European policy, even in spite, of course, of the inevitable failure of the French financial policy after the enormous damages done early here in this summer. But you do see here a real crisis. You do see the crisis of authority, which again you see is not a purely European problem. Because you see, authority is something else than power. The Russian government has an enormous amount of power. But authority really means that when you get an appeal or when you get a command, that there is in you already a certain willingness to concede it, to accede to it, to collaborate, you see, to cooperate. All this is authority, the parental authority. There must be, in authority, there must be a certain amount of love and affection mixed in. And the respect, the curious mixture of all sorts of sentiments. And this authority is collapsing in Europe. And of course, when authority collapses, then finally you see then in a tremendous amount of nakedness, then finally the harsh alternatives. If it isn't authority, it is going to be sheer power. Sheer power doing what? Sheer power really based on what? You see, here it comes the uneasiness, because after all, the European armies, with the possible exception of the French army, because never forget that the French army in 1958, in May 1958, was absolutely ready to strike and to snuff out the Fourth Republic. And only because people went on their knees before de Gaulle, and de Gaulle sourly and unwillingly and arrogantly finally said his yes to the receivership of the bankrupt Fourth French Republic, the military dictatorship of Massu didn't follow. And this was a situation which had now been repeated in the same months, almost in about the same days, not in 58, but in 68, where de Gaulle had made every conceivable preparation that if there would be a further deterioration of the French internal situation, really to take over. And the situation is very complex. You see, the communists, for instance, who are old line men in the whole game of the political forms and the political experience, they are terrified by the New West. They want to use it, but they see it's a very dangerous thing to use. We had in Italy, you had an Italian communist poet who has written an ode to the Italian police battling the students. And you see, roughly this ode begins, I'm trying now to give it to you freely as I remember it. I never took down the name, unfortunately, of that poet. He says, I'm greeting you, humble sons of workers in dingy factories. I'm greeting you, the policemen, humble sons of workers, of peasants in sun-drenched fields, spat upon and vilified by the long-haired, fat sons of the bourgeoisie. In other words, you see, the new left, the youth movement, which rebels for reasons I can very well see, because after all, I'm an old-line conservative, and I look at it, you see, from the other angle. But they do not think dialectically, they do not think what counter-forces they bring finally on the plan. And there you see sometimes between this country here, I should say it in all candor, and in Germany in 1932, I see certain analogies. And then, of course, Brüning, who was the counterplay of Hitler, whom I've met in this country here because I spent these years in your country, has told me how he tried to restore the monarchy to forestall the rise of a man like Hitler. And of course, Hindenburg said, no, I've given the oath to the Constitution, I'm a monarchist, I despise the Republic, but I can't do it. I'm bound. And then, of course, Schleicher, General Schleicher, who wanted to get the aid of the German trade unions to have a military dictatorship supported by the trade unions in order to forestall the rise of the Nazis. In other words, taking his cue from Miguel Primo de Rivera, the Spanish dictator, and the trade unions did not cooperate. What will we get? Will we get military dictatorships? Because you see, what Europe is now a country, and always has been a continent, in the last 50 years, a continent of the provisional. And let me go only one moment back to France. How provisional Europe is, how the order really doesn't stick, is very well symbolized by a poster of the Sade paint manufacturing company, which you could see in the French subways in the early 1950s. It showed 4 Mariannes. Marianne, as you know, is the symbol of the French Republic. A nice, healthy young woman with the Phrygian cap. And a 5th little Marianne looking around the corner. And the text said, the republics come and go, but the Sade paints stay forever. And that, I think, highlights the European scene far, far better than some very big and fat books. The things are all rootless. The things are all hanging in question. There's a question mark around practically everything in Europe, but it needs a certain perspicacity and a certain, let us say, fingertip feeling to discover really just that. But you see here military dictatorship, return of monarchies. Of course, there's the Russian dividing line, which makes everything provisional, doubly provisional in one sense, and irreplaceable on the other, because you don't want to change really horses in midstream, and Europe is permanently, so to say, in midstream. What will happen is very difficult to know. You only see the Hippocratic traits on the faces of European democracy. And for a last thought, let us go back again to the Acropolis. Well, the Acropolis is in a way the cradle of our entire Western civilization. And there you see the Areopag, and I mentioned to you Socrates, the condemnation of Socrates. And then you see the Syntagma place. And behind the Syntagma place you see the royal palace, where democracy was born, there was a king only until a few months really ago. And then there you have a military dictatorship. And you see what Polybius called the anakyklos, is the going around in great circles. They do not have to repeat themselves with photographic accuracy, but they do. And therefore, in the case of Europe, as in the case of the rest of the world, one must be deeply and profoundly conscious of these ever-going changes and ever-going challenges, and never think that if you have achieved a certain form of government, that then history really comes to an end and the pendulum ceases to swing. It goes on and on swinging. Thank you so much.
Dr. Leddihn, will you return with me to the rostrum, please? We have a number of questions, some of which I'm sure you have touched upon, but I'm going to ask them and give you a chance to enlarge on it, if I may. First question, why should we expect the democracy of our founding fathers to fit the modern world atomic age?
Well, there ain't no such animal. There was no democracy of the founding fathers. Their picture was radically different, and I think in many ways more modern than the concepts here today. Because I do not think, as I tried to express to you, that by counting noses, you really can come to rational conclusions. That, in other words, more democracy is more amateurism. And this is something we cannot afford. But on the other hand, in the same breath, I must always add that I'm terrified also by the prospect of experts in an administrative state ruling and administrating us in very cold blood. So in other words, there is really a Scylla and Charybdis, but the founding fathers, curiously enough, were not as old-fashioned as we sometimes too readily assume.
What is happening to humankind? This questioner asks. The free seemingly want to enslave themselves. The enslaved are struggling for freedom.
Yeah, you see, man is a dialectic creature. And if you speak about the leftist movements west of the Iron Curtain, it's quite true. You see east of the Iron Curtain the desperate desire for freedom. As a matter of fact, in all likelihood, I think many more people are reading voluntarily with interest Karl Marx west of the Iron Curtain than east. In my whole summer in 1963, which I spent in the Soviet Union, I encountered, and I've spoken with innumerable people, I have only encountered 3 truly convinced male communists. And I'm quite sure that if I would visit now, let us say the campus of the University of Frankfurt, I don't want to go too near to your home, then of course, and don't forget, and these students of the University of Frankfurt who demonstrated were physically attacked by workers' wives who hit them with their umbrellas and said, "You swine, you go home and study, because you studied at our expense anyhow." You see here the dialectical nature of man, and the need to think here really dialectically, also not in a Marxian Hegelian sense.
I think you touched upon this question too, Doctor, but it reads, has any country in the world ever really been a democracy?
A direct democracy you really had in a number of Swiss cantons. Of course, they have no female suffrage. You see, that is because a woman doesn't bear arms in Switzerland, and you are only fully a citizen in the Swiss mind if you bear arms. Don't forget, this is the country where you serve your country every year until you're 42 years old. You can volunteer until 55, and where in every public office is the picture of the commanding general, never ever of a president. In other words, Switzerland, which is the model democracy, is a military democracy. No. But it is, if you forget now the lack of it, it is a very, very genuine democracy. That's really the case. And so have been other smaller countries, but as soon as the country is really very large, there are too many sieves. And of course, the founding fathers never envisaged a democracy. The word democracy neither appears in the Declaration of Independence nor in the Constitution. The word republic appears neither in the Declaration of Independence nor in the Constitution of the United States, only as an adjective. Member states must have a republican constitution. United States is not called a republic. Even a man like Jefferson still thought about the possibility, and this is a language strange to the man in the street, that a free people can be ruled by a monarch. And the phrase, I hope you read the fine print in the Declaration, and not only the preamble. George III, a prince not fit to be the ruler of a free people. Because we always are going to be ruled. We never can really rule ourselves. That's a paradise dream. And all our effort should be to be as free as possible and feel the heavy hand of government as little as possible.
There were several questions submitted that followed this same type of wording, Doctor. Is democracy going to fail in the United States? And if so, why?
I'm giving to you to this a philosophic answer. An unnamed Viennese philosopher once said, everything, in the Viennese dialect it sounds nicer, everything has an end, only the sausage has two. And there has never been a form of government which in history lasted forever. But the only burning question is, and think about Germany in 1932, will there be something better to follow or something worse? And therefore, you see, these needs thinking or rethinking. What would happen to this country if in the next 8 years, or 4 or 8 years, law and order will not be restored? What are then the aspects or prospects? You know, everything is, sometimes the evolutions are very slow. Think about the Medicis, drugstore people from Florence. 350 years it took them to become Grand Dukes of Tuscany. They had the patience. You see, everything changes. Everything changes. A Christian verb says, the world whirls around and only the cross stands. Never attach yourselves to values which one day will perish or must be adapted or must be radically changed. Will it be a military dictatorship? A military dictatorship of all forms of dictatorship is still the mildest form. Look at the liberalization of present-day Spain. But we must, you see, all these things must be viewed and thought with a certain amount of secular impiety. You see, secular impiety. But think about the basic ideals. And the basic ideal is not the majority ideal, it's of course not the equality ideal. The basic ideal is personal freedom. And the question is, if it comes to the worst, what form of government, under what form of government is there a good chance that freedom, personal human freedom, free enterprise, the idea of liberty will really be preserved? And very often, as the Italian case I told you about the Italian elections, it may be not the idea that you just count votes.
Dr. Leddihn, I know that in your talk you referred to the question of authority versus power. I also know from what you told me that you have lectured at San Francisco State. Do you think that the problem that we're facing there today and the militancy shown by those students involves the question of authority versus power?
Yeah, I don't know exactly how you refer to, but in a chaos, if chaos is anywhere, and if authority fails, power inevitably will come into play. This may be either the power of the many, the power of the mobs, because also that is power, don't forget that, or the power of those whose legal and constitutional task it is to restore law and order. Then, of course, the appeal to authority, if authority has been destroyed, and authority has been destroyed in many parts of the world. Power is the only answer. But of course, for heaven's sakes, I would say power which is intelligently and generously, very important word, and generously used.
This questioner asks, some representatives to the European Economic Community express that there is a need for political integration as well as economic integration. Will you please comment, both pro and con?
I would say certainly that we have to integrate economically, that we also have to integrate politically, but of course we should be careful in the latter, because the genius of Europe, every continent or every country has its own genius, is diversity. In other words, that this integration of Europe, I think de Gaulle's formula doesn't necessarily mean de Gaulle's ideas. Une Europe des patries, that means a Europe of fatherlands, but coordinated. That should be very, very definitely our ideal. And of course, obviously, in close cooperation with the other free countries of the world, and that means primarily, of course, the United States, because the Atlantic Ocean really is a binding piece of water.
Is the university student unrest in Florence and Paris communistic inspired, in your opinion?
I don't think so in its origins. Of course, wherever there is disorder and anarchy, the communists will try to utilize this to their own ends. But it is equally true that the French Communist Party was really desperate, and from that ode to the policeman by a communist writer, you can see very well indeed how the Communist Party is unhappy about it. Because actually, you know, the student riots and the student ferment is one of an anarchical character, not of a communistic character. And the anarchists, you must leave it to the anarchists, were that group in the old Soviet Union who fought on against communism long after all the other parties had given up. Because there's the curious thing, you see, the anarchist stands for total liberty, and the communists for total control. And finally, in 1924, immediately after the death of Lenin, all anarchists in all Russian prisons were all rubbed out. So you see, the anarchists are a very uneasy partner for communism.
Do the political coalitions in Western Europe tend to provide more democratic rule than America's two-party system?
I don't think so, and primarily for the reason, because if you have three parties, for instance, and the third party is very small and sits in the center, I'm thinking here especially of the old German center party, then you can get a minority tyranny, because that party is going to align itself in one vote taking with the right and the other vote taking with the left, and can play out one party against another. That's the reason, Lasky said, the two-party system gives you the optimum. But the two-party system is not something you can decree. The two-party system is something which comes naturally. And it came in America in the past very naturally, because you had an enormous political uniformity in this country. So that, let us say, a liberal Republican and a liberal Democrat had more in common than a conservative Democrat and a conservative Republican. In other words, it cut across state lines. If you took, for instance, the subway in New York, and you took out, let us say, 6 p.m., all the 10,000 human sardines, every one of them, if asked, would believe in the Republic as the best and most modern form of government. And 999 out of 1,000, except the one who read the Founding Fathers, would have believed that democracy is the most ideal procedure. You do the same thing today in Spain. You stop the Madrid or the Barcelona subways. They are broad gauge. They have many more human sardines than the New York subway. And of course, the one would be a liberal Democrat. The next one is a Trotskyite communist. The third one an anarchist. The fourth one a liberal monarchist. The fifth one a traditionalist monarchist. The 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th. I can give you all the 28 different groups. And when I once talked to a Spanish lawyer and said, my dear friend, you had 28 different parties at the last free election, the man pounded the table and said, this is a dirty lie, because we have 28 million different parties. As many parties as there are Spaniards. But this is not conducive, and do not forget that brilliant passage in George Washington's farewell address, which was ghostwritten by Alexander Hamilton, when he said the party spirit, the factional spirit, they can afford it in the monarchies of Europe, but we can't afford it here. But you are in a situation now where such possibilities, the first time in your history, are really very concretely on the horizon.
And now let us jump into semantics. I think if I take the title Neo-Liberalism and Neo-Conservatism into consideration, that many of you will be dissatisfied. I think we ought to go more basically into semantics. Now, this is an essentially European lecture by a European continental, which is very important to remember. But nevertheless, this little lecture will not be lacking in constant allusions to the American scene, or rather, to the American past, because I do not want to deal with present, day in, day out American politics, but rather with this republic with a wider outlook and in greater generalities. Now, I was born, unlike, of course, most of you, there are a few exceptions. I was born the subject of a monarch. The tradition of this country in its independence, of course, is a republican tradition. But bear here one thing in mind, and that is very, very important to remember, that after all, aristocracies usually have a republican inclination. In other words, aristocracies either like republics, in extreme cases always will form republics, because obviously in a monarchy they can only play the second fiddle to the king's first. You take the typical cases of Genoa and Venice. Sometimes they might like a relatively absolute monarch, but you remember what the old Prussian Junker said, und der König absolut, wenn unseren Willen tut. Let's give to the king an absolute rule or reign, provided he really carries out our wishes. In other words, aristocracies therefore either were downright republican, they were in favor of elective monarchies, of monarchs elected by the aristocracy. The case of the Polish Republic, you see, or they want a monarchy where the king's power was something very shadowy and not really effective, as we have seen in the whole constitutional development of Britain. And of course, this country here, as you all know very well and well realized, was essentially an aristocratic republic. I do not say a republic of a nobility, but certainly an aristocratic republic. And you are quite aware of the fact that this is an aristocratic republic if you go to Washington, D.C., and there you find in front of the White House, you find Jackson Square. In Jackson Square, right in the middle, is the monument of Old Hickory, called himself a Democrat, and yet really got into the White House. But in the four corners of Jackson Square, you see the four monuments, the four European noblemen who came to this country to fight for the great aristocratic ideal, which naturally is not equality, but which is liberty. Tadeusz Kościuszko, Baron von Steuben, the Comte de Rochambeau, the Marquis de Lafayette. Count Pulaski is, you know, the only general of the Union who lost his life, has his monument in Savannah, and the noblest of them all, the finest of them, the real witness, let us say, to my thesis, Armand Tuffin, Marquis de la Rouerie, has no monument whatsoever in the United States. As a matter of fact, he is terribly unknown, and yet this man came to this country before Lafayette. He stayed in this country until after Lafayette. He was a personal friend of George Washington. He was a member of the Order of the Cincinnati. And then finally he went back to France, and there he saw the menacing dark clouds of democracy arise. And so he wrote to his friend George Washington that he really planned to return to the United States, to escape democracy, to remain a free man. But since he was a devout Christian, a man with great religiosity and devotion, he realized his real duty was to stay where he was and to face the music. And then he organized the resistance in Brittany, the Chouannerie, the second part, the one was in the Vendée, and there in Brittany, while in hiding, while organizing, together with an American friend, Major Schaffner, and with his beautiful cousin, to whom he gave on a ribbon the Order of the Cincinnati, and who acted as his messenger on a black stallion. He died while he was in hiding in the castle La Guillaumerie. Probably he had meningitis. The Jacobins closed in on him. Of course, they couldn't find him in the castle. They finally made the butler drunk. The butler told the truth that he was there, that he had died, that he was buried. They dug him up. They decapitated his corpse and rubbed his decaying head into the face of the countess who owned the castle. Needless to say, the whole family was guillotined. His cousin also, she cut her own hair off. She refused very manly to accept the consolation of a priest who had given an oath on the Constitution, perjurer in her eyes, and so these people went down. But I mention Armand Tuffin de la Rouerie, you see, because that man had come to this country here and had really fought for freedom, for the ideal of liberty, had then gone back to France and had fought against democracy. He was a genuine liberal. He was therefore an anti-democrat. Now, I have already brought in two pieces of semantics. Now, what is really democracy? Because since everybody talks about it, of course, naturally, nobody knows what it means. And what is liberalism, genuine liberalism, as it is understood on this wide globe, but I must say, unfortunately, misunderstood in this country here. Now, democracy really is a purely political term. It answers the question, who should rule? And the answer it gives is the majority of politically equal citizens, either in person or through their representatives. In other words, you cannot say, let us say, a millionaire, Mr. Green Pimple, who has a colored chauffeur and calls him by the first name, and he calls his master by the first name. They sit down together in the drugstore. That man is demophile, but he is not necessarily democratic. Monarchs, absolute monarchs, very often have been demophile, but an absolute monarch cannot be democratic. So you see, these terms mean power, kratos, and this is a strong power. This is not arché, as you find it in monarchy. You see, this is strong power of the people. Majority rule and political equality. Whereas liberalism, rightly understood, does not answer the question who should rule, but how should government be exercised. And the answer it gives is, regardless of who rules, government and rule must be exercised in such a way that each individual enjoys the greatest amount of personal liberty. Of course, well understood, the greatest amount of personal liberty still compatible with the common good. Now that is liberalism. Now, you see, in this sense, of course, needless to tell you, because I think you all know, the Founding Fathers were not Democrats, but the Founding Fathers were liberals. As a matter of fact, it is very questionable whether we can even glibly and easily speak about Jeffersonian democracy. Because Jefferson, if you read his collected works, and there's a lot to be read, you see, because after all they are enormous, only towards the end of his life, should we say in his dotage, one said in a letter, as a matter of fact, you might call me a Democrat. But this was the only time. The man, of course, was really, the Jeffersonian outlook is really a republic of free yeomen, a republic of land-owning farmers and led by the natural aristoi, by an aristocracy of achievement, of course, rather than of birth. But George Washington, of course, was violently opposed to democracy. So was John Adams. Of course, who had the harshest word about democracy. So was Madison, who said fairly prophetically, once we have democracy in this country, private property would not be secure any longer. A real anti-democrat was Gouverneur Morris. A man like Fisher Ames was naturally a radically anti-democrat. So all these men who were liberals, who were interested in personal liberty, were not really interested in equality. And this is the reason why, when the American Republic came into being, the enthusiasm in Europe was among the nobility and not at all among the common man. You see, that explains, as a matter of fact, we can go even a little step further back and say there was no initial hostility of the founding fathers against the monarchical principle either. If you ever read the Declaration of Independence, because I'm absolutely certain that you all know the preamble by heart, but I'm not quite sure whether you also read, as you ought to read an insurance policy, the fine print, that you really discover there the phrase about George III, a prince not fit to be the ruler of the free people. And very often slyly and sadistically, I speak about rulers of free people until somebody lifts his hands and says, sir, you misunderstand our whole mind. A free people rules itself. It has no ruler. It governs itself. And then I say, well, wait a moment, where did I get this phrase from? I got it from the Declaration of Independence. Because as Francis Weaver already said, it points out that this particular person, this man George III, had not the qualities to be the ruler of a free people, because needless to say, we always are ruled. There is no escape, there is no self-rule. This is an illusion. With the fall and with original sin, a government has become a government, a forceful government with authority and power, and with coactive resources has become our fate. And it is only a sort of curious effort to get around original sin and have a paradisiac and utopian notion that we can rule ourselves. On April the 15th, when you write out your income tax declaration, you'll be very much aware of the fact that you are being ruled. And of course, who rules? The majority rules. The majority rules, and of course, its representatives, even over the minority who never voted for it. You see, in democracy, there is a certain aspect. It reminds me very often of nudism. Nudism, you see, is another effort to get around original sin, the idea being if we only take our clothes off, our sexual problem will be solved, and as you know very well, it isn't solved in Japan at all. We have to face our human frailties, and we have to face our condition humaine, our human situation. The United States Constitution, of course, naturally was built up, as you know very well indeed, as a regime and mixtum, and thereby does really belong to the great Western tradition. Mixed government in which monarchical and elitarian and also democratic elements, of course, are mixed. If you look, for instance, at the Swiss Constitution, this is a far more ancient tradition. The Swiss tradition, of course, is a new constitution of 1878, but a far more ancient tradition. The monarchical element is really lacking. The Swiss president is only for 1 year the chairman of the cabinet, and his name very often is not even known by an educated Swiss. In all the public offices, never ever when you see his picture, by that of the commanding general, Switzerland is a military democracy. And this is also the reason, you see, all the men have to serve up to the age of 47 every year. And this is also the reason why the women get no vote, because their argument is, well, they don't serve in the army, and he who doesn't serve in the army is not fully a citizen. It's an armed camp. It's not the cuckoo clock. It really is a completely different proposition. And it's a very tough society and a very tough little state. But the founding fathers, naturally, who were so violently opposed to democracy, they only shared an opinion which was widespread about Europe. In all the great writings, the term democracy was taken in its classic sense, as used by Plato, as used by Aristotle, and there were also the two terrifying pictures of the two persons who had been killed, who had been murdered by democracy, and the death of these two persons, one a philosopher and one a god. These two deaths really are the two great pillars of Western history. That is Socrates and our Lord Jesus Christ. Socrates, I'm quite sure you know something about Socrates. You have heard that the main accusation was the corruption of youth. But what this corruption of youth really means, there was absolutely not the slightest sexual implication. The corruption of youth was a political corruption of youth. Socrates ridiculed democracy. Socrates cited Homer, ukagaton polykoiranie heis koiranos esto. In other words, he made monarchist propaganda. And that was the crime of Socrates. I have never ever found an American textbook in which this was really mentioned. If you don't believe my words, look it up in the Encyclopedia Britannica under Socrates in the 11th edition. And the other man was our Lord. And it was our Lord who fell in the hands of a very pitiful person, and that is an agnostic liberal. I'm using this word liberal so in the European sense, in the classic sense. A man who did not believe the truth was attainable. Because when our Lord says, I have come to be witness of truth, then Pilate asked him, Ti esti aletheia? What is truth? And without waiting for an answer, he passes Jesus Christ, walks out to the balcony, sees the howling mob. And of course, they demand his death. You consult the people. I mean, you're counting notes. See, because either you have a concept of truth, this is true and this is untrue, or if this, then you may count your buttons. You see, this is one way, you throw dice, put cards down, or you count those consent. 40 million Frenchmen can't be wrong. 40 million Frenchmen can be very wrong indeed. In 1932, 60% of the Germans voted for slavery. You see, I mean, the counting of those doesn't give us any clue as to true or untrue, as to just or unjust. But you see, these pictures were strong in Europe, these concepts, democracy. I mean, finally, when Aristotle fled Athens and he packed his suitcases, luckily he didn't send them through the Piedmont Airlines, of course, with Madeira, his reaction was, I'm trying to escape the fate of Socrates. They are going to be after me. Public opinion is going to maul me again. I'm again going to stand on the Areopag. But you see here now, we must take a step further, because what interests us really is this issue. Liberty, the principle of liberalism, rightly understood, and democracy. What sort of human drives are there embodied? Then, of course, we are going to explain the phases of liberalism. Democracy is an iron principle, but liberalism has its phases and its metamorphosis. We all have two drives. The one drive, and it's all of us, is towards identity. The other drive for diversity. We may be in situations, in moods, we want to be together with people of our own age, our own convictions, our own faith, our own sex, our own background, our own class. We enjoy identity. And then there is another drive, which is a romantic drive. No, we want to be together with people of another sex, of another conviction. We want to travel. We want to hear music we never heard before. If we want to eat food we have never eaten before. We're antagonistic to repetition. And do not forget that this drive for diversity, this hunger for something new, for a change, this readiness to establish a difficult contact across oceans, across boundaries, that this is a drive which is purely human. Because the simple gregariousness is on an animal level. You might give to the dog every evening the same sausage, and he shows you full gratitude. But every evening the 6-inch porterhouse steak after all, and for lunch also, and for breakfast, of course, finally, even steak would be too much for him. We want diversity. This is human. And there lies in the acceptance of diversity a real magnanimity. There lies there even a certain virtue. But you see here, democracy is really identitarian. There is an identitarian element, and this identitarian element has become something frighteningly dominant in our modern civilization. Of course, it starts with the archaeological revival of democracy through the French Revolution, through a man like Rousseau, and then finally also to a man who is insufficiently explored as a diabolical political genius and philosophical genius, the Marquis de Sade. Because usually he's only known for his perversions, but in his works there's a colossal amount of politics. He is actually, and this is the interesting little sidelight about it, which is an interesting sidelight, he's the man responsible for the storm of the Bastille, more or less. I mean, what is the evidence to that? The evidence is that he was locked up in the Bastille until your national holiday. That means until July 4th, 1789. There was a ferment in Paris, and with the help of a funnel, he shouted to the people, an innocent man is being held here. July 2nd, July 3rd. He threw little pieces of paper with the same words, come and liberate me, an innocent man is held back in the Bastille. So they found in the whole quartier, the feeling spread, the feeling was said there's an innocent man there, because do not forget the Bastille has not been used for political prisoner already for a long, 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 long time. Delaunay, the governor of the Bastille, desperately wrote to the Minister of the Interior. We all have the letters, you see. What shall I do with this man? I mean, he's really dangerous. He should really go to the place where he belongs, to Charenton, to the hospital of the criminally insane. And actually, on July 4th, he was transported to Charenton. But you see, the ferment was there. 10 days later, the Bastille is being stormed. The poor old veterans are massacred. There are only 4 forgers there in the Bastille, 2 insane people for observation, and a dissolute young man who had been locked up upon the request of his family, as was the case of the Divine Marquis. The Divine Marquis was then finally liberated from the hospital of the criminally insane, and as a lot of criminally insane people in our days too, became a great local political leader in Paris, the Section des Pistes. Now, let us forget a moment now the Marquis de Sade. You see, this revival of ideologies which are essentially identitarian, this revival, you must see democracy being really buried with democratic Athens, buried under the debris of the Macedon leadership and the Macedonian rule, finally comes back, an archaeological revival. After the American War of Independence, I would never say the American Revolution was not a revolution, it's an American War of Independence. The French Revolution is a revolution. But in the French Revolution, in a forest of guillotines, the great cry, the great dramatic force of envy, the great dynamism of identitarianism, La République une, indivisible, and in this republic one and indivisible, all people should be the same. It's a pity that the final plans were not carried out. Already there was the plan to have a uniform, a civilian uniform for every Frenchman and every Frenchwoman. There already was the decree signed by Robespierre that all the towers of all the spires of all the churches ought to be demolished because they contradicted the principle of equality. And one church in Bastille, already they destroyed the church tower. The decree was also accepted already by the Commune of Strasbourg. They were quite very luckily Robespierre fell. But you see, the vision is always a country of one language, one race, one class, and preferably one income, maybe finally of one sex. I mean, we see tendencies nowadays already, if you keep your eyes open, of one age, old people dressing up like youngsters. In other words, the fear of differences. And to view the person who dares to be different, any non-conformity, as something criminal. Now, whether it's democracy, nationalism, socialism, national socialism, fascism, communism, this oneness, this hatred against differentiation is immensely strong and really, so to say, paralyzes the masses. His Lordship, Bertrand Russell, who could not possibly be declared to be a thinker of the right, but a thinker of the left, in his ideal of happiness, he emphasizes the fact that after all, the driving force in democracy, the driving force in it is envy. Nobody should be better than I am. But immediately there is the thought of suspicion, if you are different, maybe therefore you think thereby you are better. I had a curious experience almost 30 years ago, 29 years ago. I was innocent in this country here. Somebody said, I asked somebody, well, what is he like? And he said, well, I mean, he's a fellow like you and me, of course. And I said, quite innocent. They said, look at me now, a fellow like you, a fellow like me. Immediately the reaction was, you think I'm better than I am. Because, of course, you see, to me it was unthinkable who were different. You see, but fellow like you and me, and there is no such thing. Because we human beings, we are basically unique, and only in our contortion, in our disfiguration, we become identical, we become a crowd, we really become a mass. But now, when I speak about the liberal principle, the principle of freedom, the hunger of freedom, the hunger to be uninhibited, the desire to achieve one's real development of one's personality was, of course, always there. But only with about the end, again, of the 18th century, it received a certain ideological profile. But this yes to liberty, liberalism, rightly understood, as it is understood by the Mont Pelerin Society, as it is understood by the World Liberal Federation. The self-appointed American liberals, I mean those who profess to be liberals nowadays, their vast majority, would be unacceptable to them. Although there are some Americans, well, I think about Milton Friedman, for instance, as an example, who still insist, I am a liberal, and the rest, of course, have no right, and he's right on that, and the rest has no right to call themselves liberal. I'm old enough, I have known in America, which most of you have not known, because I lived in this country in the 1930s. And this was the time when the term liberal actually became perverted. And I contributed an article in the old American Mercury, at that time under the editorial leadership of Eugene Lyons, and he ran a series, and there was, for instance, creed of a conservative, creed of a Democrat, then came the creed of a liberal, and then came, and that was written by Oswald Garrison Villard, creed by an old-fashioned liberal. And what he called old-fashioned liberal, that was genuine liberalism. So it was during the New Deal that the word liberal completely changed its meaning. Because obviously, liberalism in Europe, a liberal party would naturally always be a party of the right, Now let us say, for instance, give an example now, the Liberal Party of Italy today. The Liberal Party of Italy sits on the right side of the chamber, between the Democristiani, between the right wing of the Democristiani and the monarchists. And of course, actually, quite a number of liberals are monarchists. Monarchism is very well compatible with liberalism. The question is really democracy? I want again here go back a little bit to make it absolutely crystal clear what the difference is. These two concepts, democracy and liberalism, belong to different categories, just like round and white. Now, a billiard ball can be round and white. Now, that would be a liberal democracy, you see. But roundness can be applied to a globe, and whiteness can be applied to a wall. And when I say that many of them are monarchists, well, obviously, because democratia, the classicism, is a very strong form of government. This is already accepted towards totalitarianism. Is, of course, finally, liberty and equality, are they really compatible? If we look at nature and we want to have equality in nature, don't we have to dynamite the mountaintops and fill the valleys? You thought. Imagine a class and the director would say, on the whole, the principle in this subject, everybody should get a B grade. Everybody should have a B grade. You know what the result would be? The result would be that those who usually get a C or a D.
One signed in 1898, Jacob Burckhardt, and then finally Lord Acton. Burckhardt, of course, is a real patrician of the city of Bâle. But these thinkers who are liberals and emphasize personal liberty, their mind is not hooked, you see, predominantly on economics, but on politics and on social theory. And these men, of course, insist that man must be freed out of their religious background. I mean, they see man endowed with an immortal soul. And this sort of destiny which man has to fulfill because God wants man free. I mean, this is their message. This is early liberalism. Now, these periods do not come one neatly after the other. They overlap. These thinkers always overlap. So pre-liberalism and early liberalism overlaps, and of course early liberalism and old liberalism and paleo-liberalism overlap. Now, paleo-liberalism, whereas the early liberals are very anti-democratic, very skeptical of democracy, fearful of majority rule, almost especially Burckhardt, having, and the Tocqueville in different ways, Burckhardt have almost a vision of the coming of the Nazis. Because never forget, you see, the Nazis, of course, they call their system eine deutsche Demokratie, a German democracy, just as Lenin calls it Demokratia von Novum, a democracy in the new fashion. And Mussolini speaks about fascism, about una democrazia organizzata, an organized democracy. I mean, they operate with the masses and for the masses and with an appeal to the masses in the majorities, and they really are democratic inasmuch as they could prove, inasmuch as we can guess that they were followed at times, in certain periods, really and truly by the majority. But then, with this skepticism of democracy, the old liberals who are agnostics, the old liberals who are anti-clerical, the old liberals who attack Christianity very often indeed because they are afraid of any dogmatic stand. All liberals are for toleration. But the old liberals are really convinced that you can only be truly tolerant provided you have no firmly grounded views. The old liberal really likes the attitude to say, I think I'm right in my own ways, and also you differ from me, you're right in your ways, we're both right and wrong. Let's make it 50-50. Because it would be delightful. I've never listened to it, but I could imagine a wonderful conversation between an old liberal and a Nazi. The Nazi says, we want to exterminate 6 million Jews, and the old liberal says, no, not a single one, and then they make it 50-50 and exterminate 3 million Jews. And so you see here the ruthlessness. You see, here's Pilate. He is the aletheia. We're going to count noses. But the old liberal, again, harkings back
to the pre-liberals are very economically minded. They are for a radically free economy. Whereas the final stage in which we are now, and I would cite men like Rueff, Villain, Röpke above, Wilhelm Röpke, extremely well known in this country, Alexander Risto, totally unknown, Alfred Müller-Armack, totally unknown, Louis Rougier, quite unknown. You see, it's interesting, the only really known man in this whole group I could name would be Wilhelm Röpke, whose books have been published partly by the Chicago University Press, partly by Regnery. You see, and these men are now harking back to the early liberals. Now you see, here's the relationship. Pre-liberals and old liberals, early liberals and neo-liberals. You see, here's the tie-in of the thing. Now economically, of course, the neoliberals is for an entirely free economy, entirely for laissez-faire, against government intervention, but with one exception. You see, here they differ from the old liberals. They are trustbusters. They say, no, we are against monophylism and colossalism. Competition must be kept alive. This is the economic problem. Therefore, the monopolization deprives the customer from his free choice. Therefore, since we believe in competition, competition must go on. And no state monolith should exist, and on the other hand, of course, no enterprise monolith should exist. The neoliberal, again, is very skeptical of democracy. The neoliberals, of course, have seen the frightening horrors of Nazism. They have seen that a nation as literate as the Germans, that under certain circumstances, with a certain economic pressure, with a certain ressentiment, with a brilliant demagoguery, you can bring in majorities to vote for tyranny. They know very well indeed that democracy is a mere frame, and through elections, through majorities, into this frame you can hang all sorts of pictures. Well, obviously, neoliberalism is a political form of the right, not of the left. Now, we have finally come to the delightful question, what is right? What is left? And I think in this piece of semantics, the greatest deal of nonsense, the greatest deal of confusion actually rules. Identitarianism and leftism, diversitarianism and rightism. Coercion, pressure, collectivism, determinism, massification, you see, unitarianism, centralization is left. Freedom, personality, free development is right. Genuine liberalism is right. And leftism is left and wrong. You see, this terminology, right and left, this terminology of right and left is an ancient, in a sense humanly, psychologically, an ancient. You see, it's biblical language. On the right are the people who are right, rightly so. In German it sounds better. Gerecht, recht, redlich. And the left is gauche. On the left are the damned. Rise ye damned of the earth, the old beginning lines of the International. We are the left, we are the damned. Here's the no. You see, here's the negation. Here's the zero. Here lies nihilism. And the right, of course, is for the person's freedom. Because you see, how often have you heard, and quite sure many of you have heard that, and I have heard that, well, we're against all extremism, of the extreme right and the extreme left, because after all, extremes always meet, and extreme right and extreme left becomes practically identical. They say, how did you come to this conclusion? Well, wouldn't you admit that the Nazis and the communists are almost identical? Yes, indeed, I admit that immediately. But why are they identical? Because they're both on the left, of course. because they're both anti-elitarian, because they're both for identity, because they hate freedom, because they hate differentiation. Ein Volk, ein Reich, ein Führer. One in both. Obsessed by the oneness both. Extremes never meet. Extremely cold and extremely hot, extremely tall and extremely small. They're always opposites. They never meet. Anybody says opposites meet, and it just doesn't know the simplest laws of logic. They don't meet. You see, all Nazism, they all are from really, whether it's the guillotine or the gas chamber or the shot in the nape of the neck, this is all one enormous tradition, and Hitler proudly has said, we are the executors, the German executors of the French Revolution. Goebbels has spoken in very, very similar terms. I mean, they have spoken all with the language of the left. Their flag is a red flag. Don't forget that. You see, theirs is a biological determinism. They come from the lab. They do not see man as man, they see man as animal. And as you can crush a bad bug, you can crush a Jew or a Pole or a Gypsy or anybody who is in your way. This is fringe materialism. And of course the materialist left, if all the materialisms are on the left, and in a sense all the spiritualities are on the right. And now, a word about conservatism. You see, I'm a man of the extreme right. I'm an arch-liberal, a man of the extreme right. I do not call myself a conservative. In this country here, I would always cooperate with all genuine conservatives, because, I mean, these are the people naturally nearest to my outlook and my heart. But I said now, genuine conservatives, you see, I mean, there are false conservatives too, you know. Old conservatism, and we know this from our European experience. You see, conservatism as an ism only really finally arises in Europe in the early 19th century. And of course, European conservatism had to fight what they called always la révolution, the revolution. And by this they meant the French Revolution and all its ramifications. Socialism was finally one. If you're politically equal, you should be materially equal. And you know, here's the enormous danger. If you put your sights entirely on an enemy, if you fight him from early morning to the late evening, you start to think like him. Because if he attacks in this way, you have to move in this way. If he attacks that way, you have to move in that way. In a sense, the enemy finally determines your movement. Not necessarily so, but the danger is there. You see? And the old conservatives had fallen prey to the danger and had really taken, and I speak now about the old conservatives in Europe, into their program all sorts of ideas which were really leftist ideas. For instance, they were nationalists. A real conservative is not a nationalist. He's not, neither is he an internationalist, but he is a supranationalist. With a certain grace, he reaches out to other nations, honors their qualities, of course saying, since I'm the son of my own people, since I'm the son of my own country, my loyalty obviously belongs to it, but this doesn't, of course, prevent me also from seeing qualities in others. You see, the real conservative, genuine conservative is never a nationalist. He's a patriot, something quite different. You see, the patriot has a patria. He has a fatherland. As a matter of fact, he would be proud. He would say, you know, in my fatherland there are so different races, there are so different nationalities, there are so different customs. It is so rich in form. And of course, only the leftists would come and say, now, we have to exile this minority, or we have to eliminate these differences, we have to make a unitary concoction out of the whole. See, this is the downfall of the old Austro-Hungarian monarchy, the rise of nationalism, of Czechoslovakia, the rise of Czech nationalism. We don't want the Sudeten Germans to expel them. In other words, this unitarism. A real conservative delights in multiformity. You know, the founder, the real founder of Hungary, Saint Stephen, King of Hungary, wrote in his will to his son, Saint Emmerich, and he said to him, and I give that to you first in Latin, unius lingue uniusque moris regnum fragile et imbecile est. And that means a kingdom of only one language and one custom is a fragile and stupidly feeble thing. And this is a language which modern man, who after all has been infected thoroughly by leftist notions. You see, he wouldn't accept that. And remember how in this country, a very leftist small movement which has, I think, completely disappeared, or almost completely disappeared, the technocrats. When the war broke out in 1941, their program was to put all Americans, all men and women, into uniforms, to give each one of them $60 a week, and also to abolish the entire foreign language trade. You see, this is a wonderful leftist program. Of course, as a communist, of course, in this sense, it's a great Khrushchev program to have by 1980, 90% of all children from the age of 6 onward in boarding schools. That is a wonderful leftist vision. But the conservative loves variety, and he is not a nationalist, he's a patriot. And he is not a militarist, but of course he's not a pacifist either. You see, conscription is an evil which, unfortunately, we have to take on us because the great enemies of freedom also have conscript armies. But it's not an ideal situation. The ideal situation is an army of volunteers, army of people who have a real vocation to fight. You see? And it's interesting, the sneering that they're mercenaries. Well, of course, they've got to do something because, after all, even the drafted commission officer gets something. You see, in other words, a man who, for a general and for a flag, a volunteer, an army of professionals, he who has really the vocation, of course, a dream today, I know, under the circumstances. So we can only progress through the acceptance of our heritage, eliminating here and there something wrong, of course not. That has to be done. There are sometimes very old and very evil things, but certainly building up. And that is the conservative outlook. And the other thing, of course, is the love for freedom. And the European conservative was a man who finally, fighting socialism, fighting communism, fighting this and that, was a man who, listening to the word liberty sounded almost evil in his ears. Isn't there some little something anarchical about that? What we need is discipline. Oh yes, what we need is also discipline, but we also need freedom. And after the enormous persecution which conservatives have suffered in Italy, but above all in Germany and in Austria, the conservatives have really woken up to the fact that liberty is really not something evil, it really is something absolutely essential. How often the word liberty is mentioned in the New Testament? Galatians, you see? There's no talk about equality in the New Testament. We are all unique and therefore totally unequal. And I've always to emphasize this in Christian colleges and universities. We are by no means equal in the eyes of God. By no means. Only since we do not know who is superior to whom, we treat each other. This is a procedure. We treat each other as brothers and sisters, but we are not equal. Because if you say that Judas Iscariot and St. John the Baptist and St. John the Evangelist were equal, well, we close shop. And Christianity makes no sense. God doesn't love us equally. He gives, according to Catholic doctrine, he gives to everybody sufficient grace to be saved, the sufficient minimum. But Christ loved St. John more than he loved St. Peter, but to St. Peter he gave the keys. You see, we are not equals in the eyes of God. We're all different. Thank God we're all different and we are all unique, and everybody of us is irreplaceable. Nobody is indispensable is a purely nihilistic slogan. Everybody is indispensable. You see, here lies the reverence for the human person. But finally, you can imagine how the new conservative in Europe and the neoliberals have become people with almost identical programs that in Europe the new liberal and the new conservative are almost indistinguishable, or are practically indistinguishable. Or that the man from one camp will write for the periodicals of the other camp, and you can't even divide the camps any longer. The conservative accepts freedom, and the liberal accepts tradition. Both accept religious values. The conservative always did, betrays it very often, but he always did it on principle. And the liberal now realizes, this is really touching if you read the work of this really brilliant German liberal, Alexander Rüstow, who only died about 3 years ago, where in his Ortsbestimmung der Gegenwart, a book which is vastly superior to the study of history. But since it doesn't exist in English, it is only known inside the German community, but will in a few years be published in English. Where he, a man who has no faith, where in 4 pages he really addresses agnostics and atheists, and he said, you, that means really we, because he belongs to them, we've got to shut our mouth. We have nothing to go on. We have nothing to offer. Everything we really enjoy, everything which is dear to us, friends of freedom, finally, fundamentally, have to be grateful to Christianity, have to be grateful to the Judeo-Christian tradition. You see, that is the language of the new liberalism. And of course, as you can see, even from that, how radically different from the American context. So much about these semantics. And I do hope now, without going into the perspectives of the future, maybe they come up in our discussion, that you might ask me about prospects, development, all such answers are always going to remain highly speculative. It is much, much easier to look into the past. Thank you so much.